Okay. All right, welcome to Northwestern Voices. Today I'm here with my guest, Paul Utke, who is our state senator for this district. And he served in that capacity for several years. So, Paul, I'm going to ask you some pre-written questions. Now, we usually don't have pre-written questions on this podcast, but you'll understand why in a minute. I'm going to ask you some pre-written questions, and that I also hope to ask a counterpart from the Democrat Party. But before I do that, I also want to ask you about your experience working in government, and particularly with Governor Walz. Okay. So a little background, just so we can put it out there. We are. This is a Friday of a week where Governor Walz has been tapped to be the running mate of Kamala Harris for the presidential race of 2024. Governor Walz is the governor of Minnesota. He's a Nebraskan by birth. He was born in 1964. He moved to Minnesota in 1996, where he became a high school social studies teacher and a football linebackers coach. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2006 and was reelected 5 times before being elected governor of Minnesota in 2018, where he has served since then. He also served in the National Guard from 1981 until May of 2005. So, Senator Utke, let me ask you first, how much overlap have you had being in the Senate during the time that Governor Walz has been in office in Minnesota?
Well, currently I'm in my 8th year. So my first 2 years were with Governor Dayton, and then, of course, now the last 6 with Governor Walz.
And how much, during that time, how much personal contact have you had with him, and how has he been to work with, just in general, coming from the perspective of a legislator from the opposing party?
Interesting question, because to be able to work with him from the opposing party is pretty rare. I've had, I think I could count the conversations, whether on the phone or in person, on one hand. Other than, if it's a social thing, and we've been over to the governor's mansion once, that's pretty typical, new legislative session, the governor invites you over, where it's around a little food and drink and beverage and people having fun, you can have a conversation. But you get back to the business of running the state, it's pretty rare for us. I've had it, I represent the Rural Caucus, which is both the Senate and the House members from rural Minnesota of the Republican Party. Back in COVID, I was the co-chair. We were trying to work with Governor Walz to tell him we need to open up rural Minnesota. We social distance by just the matter of fact, by where we live, wide open spaces and other things like that. And those conversations are extremely short. You get on the phone with them. Of course, he's got his staff on there too, so you've got multiple people on the line with you. And you have the conversation. You start out with the casual stuff, going great. Let's get down to the meat and potatoes of why we're on this phone call. Matters of seconds, the conversation's over. You cannot dive into policy and get him to participate. And same thing in person. I've had a couple different meetings where we are at the end of the session negotiating through some things. He's just not that type. And I've talked to some of our other leaders, and I said, I can't get to Walz. What's happening? They said, don't feel bad. We can't get to him either. That's just kind of the way he operates.
All right. But fair to say that you've had some experience dealing with him in Minnesota government.
Yes, I have.
All right. So now let me get to my pre-written questions, okay? All right. So the first one has to do with the role of the presidential running mate. So what are, in your view, the duties and responsibilities of the running mate to the United States presidential candidate for a party? And how do you believe Governor Walz's how do you believe that Governor Walz has the ability to fulfill those duties and responsibilities?
Well, first of all, the running mate or the vice presidential candidate is there are some duties specific for the vice president. As you could get into the duties at the Senate. He breaks ties. He or she would break a tie, that sort of thing, in a vote. But getting back to the rest of it, I think the citizens look at the vice president as someone who could step into the president's position if need be. And again, whether it's a catastrophe, a death, something really horrid, but it's that person that's a step away from that office. But a lot of times they play a secondary role, but hopefully a productive role too.
What about their role on the campaign trail?
I think the vice presidential candidate is there to support and carry the message of the presidential candidate. And we've heard it said a number of times this week, as much as the vice presidential candidates of both parties have made the news, it's still the presidential candidate that's the top of the line and top of the ticket. That's who you're actually voting for. And so in this case, last few days, Walz has been in the news a lot for a lot of different reasons. And a lot of things coming out we all knew already, but now that it's national, some of the media is picking it up and running with it, which is good. People will know. But again, it's kind of secondary chatter at this point, because we got to get back to talking about the presidential candidates, because that's who we would elect and that's who would serve in office.
And do you think that Governor Walz has any specific ability or lack thereof to fulfill the duties and responsibilities of Vice President of the United States, or just simply to play that supportive role on the campaign trail?
Well, watching him the last 6 years as governor of Minnesota, and what I've had the interactions with him and trying to do these things, to me, he's a failure. We need more than that at the level of running the United States government, the largest economy in the world. And to me, all he is somebody that licks his chops over additional tax increases, because they don't talk about tax increases. It's revenue and the things we can do with this additional revenue. Well, the state doesn't get anything that they don't take from us as taxpayers. And then you take and go back to 2020. Look at the riots in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Total lack of leadership. And that's at the state level. I've seen failure after failure. And now he wants to bring this so-called experience and expertise to the federal level. I don't see anything there but a failure. All
right. In second question, so in 1992, James Carville, the Democrat strategist, coined the famous phrase, "Is the economy stupid?" What do you perceive to be Governor Walz's record on the economy during his 5 years in office in this state? And do you believe that this record will help or hurt Vice President Harris's opinion with the voters, and why?
Well, I think there's a lot that goes into the economy. People will say, look at how well Minnesota was doing. A year ago we had a $19 billion surplus. We've had a lot of this additional revenue coming in, surpluses and such, but really that all that means is we've overtaxed the people and particularly the businesses. How has that economy been under him? Almost weekly, and sometimes it seems like it's daily, I hear about people leaving our state to move across the border to states that are much more friendly to business and even to individuals. I mean, the number of people that just say, the tax rate that I'm having to pay to live in this state isn't worth it. And they go somewhere else. And so I look at it as we're exporting our economy constantly. We're still doing okay, but we're going to see deficits coming. And part of that is because our economy is leaving this state, and we're not going to be able to keep up with the expenses that have been put in place with the bloated budget we have.
Do you believe that he's sensitive to these issues and just disagrees fundamentally with the premise that people are leaving the state, or is it more that he just doesn't see these as being important issues?
I don't think he sees them as being important, and I know other members of his party will say the same thing. We will have those arguments, whether it's in committee or even sometimes on the floor of the Senate, and you bring up how people are leaving, and they say, you guys are just making this up. They don't care. We've got a great place to live and work. They'll stay. Well, people are now moving with their pocketbooks. They're looking at, what are the personal finances? What are your business finances? And they're looking at the fact that we can just move not very far away and save so much more money. And you also have to look at what's the available workforce. There's a pretty good workforce outside our state borders, too.
Mm-hmm. And is the perception that Governor Walz is particularly sharp on economic issues, or does he rely a lot on advisors, or how hands-on is he in guiding the policy of the state and his party? Because of course now we've got a Democrat majority in House and Senate.
Right. I don't believe he's the smartest on these things, but yet all of his people, his commissioners, those are the people that he appoints. As a governor, you appoint all the commissioners who run all the agencies. They take their marching orders directly from him. They don't get to think on their own and come up with their own things and bring it to the table. He does it. It comes from him in his mouth in his office. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing is coming from real close around him. If he's taking advice from a few people, but it's a pretty close-knit circle, and it's pretty much coming from him. And as far as I'm concerned, when you look at a lot of these things, when we talk about our economy, it's been a failure because we've lived through a pretty prosperous time here the last number of years, and there's been work down in St. Paul that's going to show us in a couple years we've got some big deficits coming, and we shouldn't be there. It's because of their leadership, and it's failed.
But do you see his record on economic policy in the state being something that could be helpful to the campaign, harmful, or do you see it as more of a neutral factor?
If I was to look at that and take it in, and I don't, a lot of the people that vote don't pay that close attention, I believe, to this, but to me, it would be a detriment to the campaign because all we got to do is look back at last year and you say, Minnesota, we already had a big budget, we had a lot of good things going, and then we actually spent the $19 billion deficit. He added another $10 billion to it, increased government by 40%. To me, that's not leadership, and that's definitely not leadership that needs to go to Washington, D.C., where we already have, a $34+ trillion deficit. Mm-hmm. We got to worry about cutting expenses and paying off debt, and that's just not in Governor Walz's wheelhouse.
All right. Abortion is the next topic. So Governor Walz signed legislation codifying abortion rights, repealing essentially all the state's restrictions and adding protections for patients who travel from states where abortion is restricted. Among the restrictions eliminated were a 24-hour waiting period and parental consent requirement for abortion. The governor joined VP Harris to a Planned Parenthood clinic on a visit to a Planned Parenthood clinic in March. Now, President Trump, I'm sorry, this is a long question, but President Trump has consistently stated that abortion is a states' right issue and has not included a national abortion ban as a part of his party's platform in this election, to my knowledge. Given that the Supreme Court's holding in Dobbs did not address the question of fetal viability, how much of the rhetoric coming out of the Harris-Walz campaign that a Trump presidency would result in the elimination of abortion rights from states, which clearly want it, can be dismissed? Or are these fears legitimate?
No, the fears that they're trying to portray are not legitimate. And let's start talking about Minnesota. 2 years ago, that's all we heard in the campaigns was talk about the abortion issue. We as legislators, Governor Walz as governor, we had a governor's race, so the other candidates that were running for governor, none of us could have changed our abortion laws, so to speak, in Minnesota, because we are controlled by a Supreme Court ruling in 1995, Doe versus Gomez. Now, they took out, there was like 57 little protections, various protections, important protections, but yet that had been put in over the last number of years. But the abortion issue in general was controlled by the Supreme Court. But the items that you just talked about, they were some of these little protections. They did eliminate a number of them. Things like, the 24-hour waiting, a few of those that, for us, we kept doing everything we could to try to nick away at a little bit, pick away and do these things to add some protections. As an example, if the baby survived the abortion, was born alive, as soon as they were born, they got all of the same rights as you and I do for medical care. Those are the type of things they removed last year with their legislation. But the basic abortion conversation is controlled by the Supreme Court. Now, other states don't have those specific requirements or such. So the various states will vary, but like most things, this should be a state's issue. But they will argue about it this fall at the federal level. But what the Supreme Court did a couple years ago, kicking it back to the states, and from what I'm hearing President Trump talk about, he's all in favor of it staying at the states. That's where I believe it should stay.
How big of an issue do you believe that this abortion issue is going to be in this election cycle? And do you think that Walz's position and policy that he's enacted in this state is going to help or hurt Vice President Harris's chance of being elected president?
Well, Walz is all in on the extreme left side of this. He's showed that that's where he's gone the last number of years. To get elected for governor 6 years ago. I don't, it's definitely not going to bring the moderates into their camp to vote, because I think Walz is going to be that extremist again, just like every bill he signed in Minnesota was to either eliminate these protections or, in the case of abortion, now he signed the bills that made it legal up to and after birth. The baby can be born alive, and all they would be offered is comfort care, which means you keep them warm, you do whatever until they expire. Now, those things are very rare because most of your abortions take place in that 9 to 11 week area. But you do get these, we see the statistics, and there's some that get out there. But so I don't see that helping the ticket, because I believe that Vice President Harris is already there. And if anything, Walz is going to try to wiggle his way in even further to the extreme as far as I see it. So I see him running away from, the middle of the road. And usually that's what the elections are about. We as Republicans have got our solid core. They have got their solid core, and you're trying to persuade those in the middle to join your team. And I don't see that as a positive for him.
And then just kind of getting back to the first part of the question, which is that it seems as though a lot of what the Harrison and now Walz joining with her are saying about the Republican position on abortion is simply that Republicans want to eliminate entirely any right that a state, or any right for a person to have an abortion, whether the state was a liberal state like California and New York or a conservative state like Alabama, regardless, and that the threat of federal legislation. And I guess my question is, do you think that is a fair argument or a fair depiction? But whether it is or isn't, Do you think that sort of rhetoric is going to have an influence on people?
Yes. We saw it 2 years ago, the influence it had. And I know we're going to hear a lot of it. There's just no way around it because the Democrats are going to make that probably their number one issue again.
Yeah.
2022, every ad the last month or two was related to abortion. And, again, in certain states like ourselves, it means nothing because it's already in place, but they're going to use it. It's their number one talking point. I expect to hear a lot of it. Will it persuade people? It seems to get some of them, particular. Speaking of Minnesota, go to the suburban women. That's a targeted area for both parties because they're a voting bloc that they need to get on their team. And I think this is an issue that the Democrats feel they can win on. And, President Trump leading our party for the presidential race will have a little different opinion on that. I'm sure we're going to hear about, I'm going to give it back to the states because basically it's a good move for him as a candidate because wash your hands of it and give it to the states because that's where it should be. But we're going to hear a ton.
I think it's a really difficult issue for Republicans, especially because it's hard because some of the base of Republican voters, it would seem, would say that a position where you're saying let's just give it to the states isn't doing enough, right? And so you risk alienating some of your core. Let's just call them, say, Christian conservatives who would like to see some legislation be enacted on a national level. But at the same time, if that is put out there, then the Republican candidate would be feeding right into the Democrat talking point, which is that Republicans are looking to completely eliminate the right to an abortion from the state or from the entire country with one fell swoop or piece of legislation. So it's a very difficult point for the Republicans to navigate.
Well, it most certainly is because you've got those that say absolutely no abortions no matter what, and then you get to those that saving the life of the mother and incest and rape we can accept it, and then you got some that are talking a few 9-10 weeks. There's all these different things that actually divide up our Republican voters. Right. And so that's why the Democrats use this a lot because they can see it. They know how they can create chaos within our voting bloc.
Well, they seem to have more unity on the Democrats seem to have more unity on that issue.
That's exactly right. It's a tough one.
All right, moving on to immigration. So Governor Walz signed legislation last year to extend health care and public insurance to undocumented immigrants as part of a budget agreement last year. Was this policy popular in Minnesota, and will this help or hurt the Harris campaign in the fall?
Was it popular in Minnesota? No, it was a definite political divide. The Democrats were all in favor. The Republicans were all against. It's one of those things that we've seen a lot of in the last 2 years. The votes on the floor are pretty much all party line votes constantly because that divide there just created, when you talked about health care, I mean, it goes into the driver's licenses for all. They get the same driver's license that anybody else running around with a Class D driver's license has. Want to board an airplane? Yep, that looks just like the average Minnesota citizen. You've got free education for them, the free health care. We are watching our state paid health care, which is typically referred to as medical assistance or Medicaid. Those numbers exploded with COVID. We went from about 1.1 million citizens on it to up to about 1.6. We have not been able to back that off very far because we keep bringing more people on. All of these things are taking a lot of taxpayer dollars to cover. And at the same time, we're exporting a lot of our workers, as we talked about with the economy stuff here earlier. So we're exporting our economy to our neighboring states, and we're bringing in social service consumers, we're not going in the right direction. But Walz has been a big proponent of bringing more of these people on board, and it's taxing on the state. It's a hard one to work with because you can't balance the books with it.
So also on immigration, in a July 30th, 2024 interview he gave to Anderson Cooper of CNN, Governor Walz pointed to the Langford Cinema Bill, which you may or may not be familiar with, but and alleged that President Trump killed that bill in the Senate. It was an immigration bill that was put forth by the Democratic Party. And Governor Walz claimed that Border Patrol agents endorsed that bill. What was that? What was the Langford Cinema Bill, if you know, and why didn't Republicans agree to its terms?
You got me on that one. I don't know what that bill is.
Okay. So are there any other immigration policies that Governor Walz has espoused that you feel will either help or harm his candidacy?
I would think, at least in my opinion, he aligns 100% with our current Vice President Harris that open borders are fully welcome and bring them on. As many as that want to cross the border, and it isn't only the human costs of taking on these additional people that come up and are going to need services, whether it's the expense of going through schools and all this. But what do we hear the most of coming across the border is with the illegal drugs, fentanyl and those things. And we see a lot of that coming to Minnesota. And actually, being we're a northern state, we're hearing more and more about it crossing our northern border. Typically, we all talk about the southern border. The northern border is getting to be an issue too.
Okay. Let's talk about Second Amendment issues. So Governor Walz had been popular among the gun lobby as recently as 2016 when he earned an A rating from the NRA regarding his stance on the Second Amendment. That grade has now slipped to an F on account of his signing into law comprehensive gun safety measures into law in May of 2023, and other comments he made in April of that year which seemed to support a so-called assault weapons ban. Among those 2023 gun safety measures were universal background checks, which would limit private party transfers of pistols and semi-automatic weapons, extreme risk protection orders, or red flag laws, which would allow law enforcement to prevent gun possession upon receiving a report of danger. And some say that these laws are too restrictive and part of a slippery slope that could lead toward confiscation and a total ban on firearms in our state and in this country. Do you believe that Walz's record on gun ownership will help or hurt the ticket in the 2024 election?
If he's looking at his far left, they like it, but in general, it's a bad deal. It's not going to help him at all because he has said one thing at one time in his career. Like you mentioned, it wasn't that long ago, he had an A rating. Now he's got an F. He's willing to do whatever he can do to gain votes. And I think across the country, the Second Amendment is a pretty important one, even in a lot of cases for currently voting Democrats. It's just the extreme side of their party that I think is willing to give up everything. So his current standing with the Second Amendment, I think, is a detriment, a big detriment, because I always use when I have people come to the office, and it's kind of interesting. I like it when the young kids, the high school kids, come in and they usually ask questions, and it's been a few years since they've come up with some of these, but it's always around the Second Amendment because I've sponsored some constitutional carry and those type of bills. And you explain to them that when I was a kid, there were no restrictions on anything. The only thing that restricted me on the guns I had or the amount of ammunition I had was the amount of money in my pocket, because you could do anything you wanted to. And kids took, all of our vehicles in the school parking lot had guns on them in the fall if you were hunters. Not everybody was into guns and hunting, but if you were, you could walk out there, and whether it was your pickup or your car, it had your shotgun in it. The only time it was ever cased was to protect the gun. And you could go on through all this. Nothing has changed with the tool, the firearm. What's changed is us, the human beings. And they continue to restrict our laws on the firearm. And let's get back to what it really is, and that's enforcing the laws we have. We don't need any more laws. We've already got too many on the books. But let's make people be responsible with firearms rather than just taking away the law-abiding gun owners' rights. And so I think that's where a lot of people land.
I'm going to follow up on something that you said there too. You said that the tool hasn't changed, but we have. What did you mean by that?
One, you could say on how we enforce some of the laws. Mm-hmm. We turn our back on a lot of things, or now we just blame it on guns. And then the other thing is we hear a ton about, and that's mental health. It's what people are involved in nowadays. We grew up differently years ago. There was never any boredom, and there wasn't all these extra little electronic devices that sometimes lead to what we think lead to bad things. You were outdoors, you were doing things, you respected other people, you respected the tools and equipment you had in your hands. So there's some of that, but I think, that mental health and just the respect for one human being respecting another, we've lost a lot of that. And now we blame it on guns because they use guns to do something bad with.
You feel as though if the amount of guns were reduced or gun ownership was reduced in this country, that this would help in some way with I guess reducing the number of shootings and things that the Democrats do tend to raise when it comes to this issue?
No. The majority of the gun violence incidents, etc., they're not. Those people don't care about our laws. They're just they'll get what they want because most of them don't buy them through legal means, and if we make them harder to buy through legal means, okay, we talked about the drugs and stuff and coming over the border. Weapons are coming over the border too. That will only increase. They're not going to go without. So all we do through these restrictions is restrict the law-abiding citizen who wants to own some firearms.
Okay, and then I guess the last of my pre-written questions would be having to do with world peace. What experience, ability, or character trait do you believe that Governor Walz possesses that might help him assist the president, if elected, in achieving world peace?
Well, for anybody stepping into that position, it takes a while to create relationships and stuff with leaders around the world. Being a governor, I'm sure he's interacted with a few of them, and more so because of being a trading partner. The governor of Minnesota does go on trading missions. You get to meet leaders, but I think in a lot of those cases that probably isn't the actual leader of the country, but they get some of that. A lot of that probably is attained and learned on the job. Actually, President Trump was one of the few rare guys that he had these relationships before, and he gained it through private business. With his hotels and his stuff all over the world, he dealt with world leaders. So, not many people have that opportunity to gain that outside of government, and he did. And some of the people that work, let's say you come out of the Senate or some of the leadership positions within government out in Washington, D.C., you might have those connections. But so I don't think he would have a lot. And as much as I disagree with, a lot of his policies and such, I can't totally hold that against him just because it's not something that you would normally do as the governor of Minnesota is to be working with the leader of China or the leader of Russia. You might be working with their agencies to trade grain or whatever it might be. But
so what I'm hearing from you is that you believe that interpersonal relationships among those in power is central to bringing about conflict resolution.
Right. The leader is definitely important, but the team you build around you is equally, if not more important, because your people from your country this isn't one person doing these things. It's a team effort. And now if Governor Walz was building that team, I've always said to be on his team, you get on his team not by what you know, but by how you align politically. And I don't think that builds the best team. So I don't think he's the person to build this team to do national peace negotiations with the countries that we talk about and hear about a lot, whether it's China, whether it's Russia. These are
Middle East.
Big threats. Middle East, yes. You've got to be at the top of your game because they are. And we're in a challenging time in this world, so it is going to be interesting going forward, but I don't know that he adds much to that ticket at this point. But hopefully they would surround themselves with good people if they were ever to be in that position.
Okay, so enough about Governor Walz now. We didn't know that Governor Walz was going to be joined to the ticket so close to your interview time. So I thought it would be a good time to discuss these issues with you. So thank you for indulging me in that.
You bet.
And I am gonna be bringing in a Hubbard County Democrat and I'll ask him the same questions. It'll be interesting to see what he says about that. But all right, so now I would just like to hear from Paul Utke. Okay. Do you feel confident about the future of our area, state, and country?
I am very concerned for our state and our country right now with what I see going on. And I tell people the last 2 years at the state level, my first 6 years, we had a little say in it. We were in the majority in the Senate. 4 years, the House was in the minority, and of course the governor chair was always the Democrats. So you had that working relationship back and forth, but the fact was when you make everybody come to the table, and we're in the land of hockey, so I always say we could block bad bills. Because to pass something, you have to have everybody on board, but one group can block something. The last 2 years with what we've got going on in the state, to me it's like when I walk through that door in the morning, it's like somebody gave you a sucker punch to the guts. It's a sickening feeling when you see a lot of these things that I feel are harmful to our state, whether it's, we've talked about some of the abortion stuff that went through, some of the things that affect our businesses, some of the things that generate our economic prosperities. And then I look at what's going on out in Washington, D.C., they just pile it on top again. We all talk about the most important election ever coming up. I look at it as that's definitely it. We've got to get changed the way we're doing things both at the state and at the federal level because we're going down the wrong road.
Are there any positions held by your party's platform, the Republican Party, that you disagree with personally?
Not really, because I think the platform is guidance. If you asked me to recite it, I couldn't, because when you're involved in things, you hear what's going on, and you have participated in the party for a number of years. You're kind of part of it, so I don't go back and read it line for line.
Sure.
But just in what we stand for and in general, I think, I've aligned pretty good, and I look at, that's one thing, but then the area you serve, and I feel I align well with our region of the state. So when I go to vote on something or do something, to me, I don't have to think about it. It's just kind of second nature because, I feel that people put me there because for the most part, we're all on the same page. There's going to be a few people that don't like what I do, but that's just the nature of politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't be all things to all people.
That's right.
You can't please all the people all the time, or whatever they say.
Exactly.
You kind of touched on this before, but do you believe that the Democratic Party represents a threat to our country? And what are some of the best and worst aspects of that party?
Well, I think they have an issue, and we do too, in the Republican Party, and that's the extremist on both sides. And it isn't that on our side that extremist is more conservative. They just pick an issue or two, and that's the only thing they know about. Democrat Party has run into that same thing, except their extremist side, to me, has grown a fair amount in the last number of years. I look at what I would call those special interest and extremist groups down at the Capitol. They continue to grow, and they've got a loud voice. And so your typical Democrat that we may have up in our part of the state here, I don't believe that extremist group, those groups align with the people up here either, but they still support them. And that's the challenging thing. I see the extremists gone both ways, but the Democrats have been taken over. I mean, you hear that a lot even from Democrats. Mm-hmm. People tell me, I'm an old Democrat, but he said the party has left me. Yeah. And it's very true.
Mm-hmm. If, let's just say that there is VP Harrison Walz win in this election, or if Governor Walz just steps down for some other reason, who do you think might be in the running for potential candidates to be the next governor of Minnesota?
If I look at who's in the legislature, it scares me. As much as I will have conflict and disagreements with Walz, some of the next people that could step up that we've seen run in the past are even, I think, going to be harder to work with. Currently we sit with Lieutenant Governor Flanagan would be next in line if something happened before the end of the term.
Oh, okay. So she would automatically be elevated,
right.
Whether he assumes another role or for some other reason?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If there was some reason he left his job early, the lieutenant governor moves up. And then in Minnesota, the person to follow that is the president of the Senate, who happens to be right now Senator Bobby Joe Champion from North Minneapolis. Those two, if they were sitting in the governor's office, I would have even more, again, I don't line up well with Walz, mm-hmm. but I would have an even more concerns with those two, mm-hmm. Because there's things that Governor Walz will look at that are across the state. I would see the focus being pretty narrow, and typically it's going to be on race. Mm-hmm. You've got one that sides with the tribes because she has a Native background, and then the other one is African American. And I just watched the legislation that they work with, and I would hope that they would take their job seriously and cover mm-hmm. everything. But I see it being fairly narrow because of the emphasis I've seen in the bills they've worked with. And it's strictly on specifics. And mm-hmm. so at this point, and then there's been...
These are just partisan issues relating to...
Very partisan.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, it's when we sit down there and people come into my office and they've got certain specifics for a certain race or two, I go, I don't want to hear about that because mm-hmm. A lot of my stuff is health related. All races experience those same health things.
Right.
Some have additional challenges, but we need to have it open so that we treat everybody equally and fairly. And that's the approach that I like to use. But I'm afraid we'd lose that. Or there's a few people that have run for governor in the past that would probably rise up. They've increased their level of leadership within the caucus, and but to me, they're not the people I want to see running this state. So we shall see.
What about on the Republican side? Any future leaders out there who are worth mentioning?
If it's governor, we've had some that I would consider good in the past. I don't know who's going to come back and want to give it a shot. We've got some that currently, but that's a big job. That's a jump from whether you're in the House or the Senate to taking that on and having that broad scope. And part of it is how we take and pick our leaders or our candidates to run. Currently in our state, everything is done through the endorsement process, and then you go from the endorsement to the primary, etc., if need be. That process is holding back some good candidates on our side. Probably is on their side too, because they've seen our state conventions get pretty chaotic. I would like to see more of the, somehow either that gets settled down and be a respectful, intelligent decision-making process, or move it into an earlier primary. We've got to get back to where we put our best people on the ballot, and I don't know that we're doing that right now.
Okay, so Paul, you originally hailed from North Dakota. Can you just tell us a little bit about your upbringing and childhood over there?
Oh, sure. Just southwest of Fargo is my home, where I grew up. When I was first a little feller, we actually lived on a farm. And then we put our toes in the water. We came to Minnesota and spent a couple years in Lake Park, a couple years up in Greenbush, and then moved back to Enderlin. So we went full circle. So, but my dad was a farmer the first 2 stops, and then he got off the farm, bought a hardware store. That's what got us to Greenbush, and then he bought the hardware store back in our hometown of Enderlin, and he worked that until he retired. And so I lived back from 5th grade through graduation and beyond. I lived in Enderlin, and so it was that's our home turf.
And you learned the hardware business during those years, I would imagine.
Yes. Yep. That's and I never intended to get back into it, but you never know what comes next. Back in 1993, that's what brought us to Park Rapids when we bought the hardware store here in town.
Okay, and how long did you operate that?
16 years.
What are some life lessons that a person can learn from operating a retail store or a hardware store more specifically?
Well, I always looked at it in the hardware business. It was a great job for, we had our normal employees that, had to, all the stuff you had to know, because we were not only hardware, we had equipment rental, we were an outdoor power equipment dealer, so we did mechanical work on lots of different equipment, and in the early days we would fix toasters and blenders and all those type of things because they were repairable back in that day. Today everything is throwaway. But we would always have a young man or two, and we've had some young ladies that I said it was great life skills, because you never know what's coming through the door next, and somebody walks in with a whole spider web full of electrical things, and there's some switches and outlets attached to it, or it might be a plumbing maze, and they want help. And so as you lead them through that, our young employees got that experience. So once they graduated, whether it was from high school or college, and left us, they went out the door with skills that when they became a homeowner, hopefully they remembered some of that, and it would give them that boost over people that didn't have that experience.
They became handy.
That's exactly right, because in a hardware store, you touch everything from from mixing paint to fixing the lawnmowers.
And what about just dealing with customers and interacting with people on a day-to-day basis? That must have helped with that too.
That social interaction is huge. I talk about it a lot down at the Capitol, because under Health and Human Services falls the daycare and all of that. And it's, to me, those young kids need to learn social skills first. Yeah. That's the biggest thing they got to have. And when some of these things we do don't enhance that. And so, yes, that social interaction, learning how to just deal with people was huge.
People skills those are often neglected, I think. And I'm in agreement with you on that. Because a person, I feel, can obtain a lot of knowledge or even know-how in a particular area, but if they're not able to interact with somebody or to service a person's need or to just get along with someone well enough, it's a real hindrance to their ability to succeed in life.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why I always recommended people read that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. But that's a different story. But okay, so when did you first become interested in politics?
Well, I started following politics back long before I could vote. So back in probably early high school or today we'd call it middle school age. In those days it was K through 12 in one building, so you didn't have any breakup. We were all in a small school, but so it was early on. I started following it, and I didn't get active so much in it. I've never missed an election, never missed an opportunity to vote throughout all the years. But it was more so when we came to Park Rapids, and even not so much at the beginning. You kind of got to get your feet on the ground a little bit, and then you start going. It's like anything. You start going to a couple meetings, and then you get this job, and you get that job. And, before I got elected to the Senate, I was the county chair. I was the Senate District 2 chair, and I was on the executive committee of the 8th Congressional District. So you were involved in all of those things, kind of the working side of it, and then all of a sudden you get your arm twisted enough and you end up putting your name on the ballot.
That must be a kind of a strange experience to all of a sudden now you're on the ballot and it seems like they're scrutinizing your entire life and everything like that, right? Turning you upside down and inside out. What was it like experiencing that for the first time when you ran for office?
Well, it was a huge change and an undertaking because I had spent 7 years on the Park Rapids City Council prior to that. I got on because they had a vacancy, and I gave them a letter of application, and they chose me. And then I went through 2 election cycles unopposed, so you pay your $2 and you continue on. And then all of a sudden you get into this, and now
you got some opposition that's looking for stuff, right?
In 2016, we took on an incumbent that had been in for a number of years, served first in the House and Senate, and well-established. He was the tax chair of their caucus. So we took on somebody that was well established and such too, but that was President Trump's first election. Our region was turning at that point. When I ran in 2016, that seat had been held, and of course the lines change because they get moved around every 10 years, but yet this region and that so-called district had been held by the Democrats since 1963, I believe. It was back to where it was before Democrats and Republicans, back when they were conservatives and liberals.
Right.
I mean, when the party names changed. So they had held it a long time, but it worked for us. There was a lot of things going. The northern Minnesota, the Iron Range was coming our way. And President Trump's race that year helped us a lot. It was fun knocking on some of those doors. And we get the stuff on our phone. We can have a pretty good idea who's in that house when we knock on it. And these ladies would be of age that their husbands were probably World War II vets.
Yeah.
Trump was talking support for the military and the veterans and all. He was talking their language. And it got to be fun because these gals had a ton of energy. They'd come to the door and they'd say, "Oh, if I only had more get up and go, I'd be out there campaigning for them." I'm going, they might be in their upper 80s, knocking on the door of 90, and they're full of enough energy they could go out and run a race. It was that kind of interaction that made the big undertaking kind of fun at the same time. So it was a decent experience.
Yeah. And you weren't overcome by any of like the negative oppo stuff or anything like that.
They throw some stuff at you at the end, but they'll dig anything and make up things, and it's unfortunate. I wished we could get that out of all the races and keep it factual. Yeah. But unfortunately, you kind of expect something at some point, and you just kind of.
You brace yourself.
You just deal with it and keep going the way you just got to
brush it off.
You got to shed water like a duck sheds water.
All right. So my last question is, what are some traits that you would look for in a young person who is looking to succeed in this area?
A big part of what we do, the politics is the ultimate team game. So just having that interaction, being part of groups, if you're in the corner by yourself, unfortunately, that's not probably the thing you want to get involved in. It's a social thing. You've got to embrace and enjoy walking into a group of people and just meeting them. And I'm definitely not the person that goes in and wants to jump on the podium and start talking to everybody.
Sure.
I can, but I like to just socially interact and get to know people, and you've got to enjoy that part of it, and just enjoy people and accept them for who they are. I mean, you're going to run into some people that disagree. You got to embrace that too. But it's just you gotta welcome people. I had an employee one time. He worked for me for a while and said, this just isn't for me, because he hadn't worked in something where he was face to face with people all day long. Yeah. And that's the big part of what we do. You just have to enjoy that. And it's even like down in St. Paul, I tell people, number one, you got to have thick skin and a good sense of humor.
Sure.
But you have to embrace the craziness, because and you can't let it get to you. If that stuff could get to you, you're going to fail instantly. It's just welcoming people and having fun doing it.
Yeah. All right. Well, my guest has been State Senator Paul Utke, and I'm also going to say fellow Rotarian. And Paul, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for being willing to come in and talk about these current events that have transpired with our state's governor. And I hope we didn't shortchange you in terms of the stuff that we would have talked about anyway. So
thank you very much. This was fun, and who knows what comes up next.
Yeah, that's right. We'd love to have you back someday. So
super.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thank you.